Well, greetings, church family. Today's daily Bible reading had us in Judges chapters 19 and 20. And hopefully, you've already read this passage, and so you'll know that there is a huge parental warning, especially for chapter 19, because of some of the horrible sins that take place in that chapter. Chapter 19, 1 through 9, we see that's the third time now in the book of Judges that we've been told these events occurred when there was no king in Israel. Chapter 17, verse 6, and chapter 18, verse 1 are the other two times. But at the same time, we have to be careful. Not everything is going to be presented in biblical Hebrew in a chronological fashion. Sometimes things are ordered in a topical fashion, and that's actually the case here. When you get ahead to mid chapter 20, verse 28, we see that Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, is still the high priest at this time. So the events of chapters 19 and 20 actually occur much earlier in the book of Judges chronologically. Topically, they're occurring near the end, and I think we see that with these discussion of no king, no king, no king for the people. Both no human king, because this was, of course, before Saul, but also no recognition at this latter point of time of Yahweh as king. And so what we see here is a troubled relationship between a Levite and his concubine wife from Bethlehem in Judah, and it looks to be improving. The man is chasing down his wife, he's speaking to her tenderly, he's making amends, he's even being welcomed warmly by his father-in-law. Chapter 19, verses 10 through 15, after much feasting and fellowship, the Levite and his concubine wife left late one day to return home together along with the man's servant. And of course, travel in those days nowhere near as quick as today. And so in his attempt to avoid staying with foreigners, the Jebusites, who still occupied Jerusalem, the Levite pushed for Gibeah in Benjamin, where they arrived at night, thinking he'll be safe among the people of Israel, not safe among the pagans who were still occupying parts of the land. Chapter 19, verses 16 through 21, at first he seems right. There's a warm greeting initially in Gibeah. An Ephraimite who stays there welcomes the traveling group into his home so that they would not have to stay in the open square. And it's at this point, especially as we get to verses 22 through 30, that we see that this is a scene that is scarily reminiscent of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. We see the men of the city described as worthless fellows, just as the hirelings of Abimelech in Judges 9 and Jephthah's men in Judges 11 both are described. And these worthless men, they try to have wicked homosexual relations with the Levite man, just as the Sodomites tried with the angels who visited Lot in Genesis 19. Similar to Lot, the host tries to protect his guests and keep such horrid wickedness from occurring by, sadly, offering his own daughter as a replacement. Now, in addition, the Ephraimite in Judges 19 also offers the Levite's own concubine wife. And the concubine is tossed out the door and just used by the men. Horrible, horrible, made subject to sexual abuse all night long. Absolutely despicable what occurred, trading one wicked, abominable deed for another. And the result is the death of the poor woman at her doorstep, a death which traumatized her Levite husband and enraged him so much that he actually mutilated her body to send a message to the 12 tribes of Israel of what these Benjaminites in Gibeah did to his wife. In chapter 20, as a response, verses 1 through 17, we see Israelite soldiers from all across the region, from north in Dan to south in Beersheba, gathered together, 11 tribes unified against the horrors that the men of Benjamin in Gibeah were guilty of regarding the Levite's wife. And it's sad that it took such an awfully evil act to unify most of Israel. And even then, they're unified against another tribe of Israel. There's a civil war that's taking place. And rather than calling their kinsmen to repentance as they should have done, the Benjaminites double down. They gather at Gibeah to defend the evildoers against the rest of Israel. They do what Dale Ralph Davis, a commentator, said. They show allegiance to New Sodom, is what he calls it, there in Gibeah, instead of remaining allied with Yahweh. Now in chapter 20, verses 18 through 35, we see that the Lord is fully behind the combined forces of the other tribes. Note that the people of Israel go to the Lord 3 separate times, verses 18, 23, and 27, to get the Lord's direction rather than go by their own human wisdom. Trust in the Lord, right, with all our hearts, and lean not on our own understanding is the wisdom given in Proverbs. And certainly this is what the men are doing at this point. Apparently, the Ark of the Covenant was in Bethel, instead of Shiloh at this time. Perhaps it moved to Shiloh later. And this actually made it a shorter trip from Gibeon to ask for the Lord's wisdom and direction. Aaron's grandson Phinehas is then mentioned here as the high priest, and of course this lets us know this took place much earlier in the time of the judges. The Lord is fully supportive of Israel's combat with Benjamin. He's going to give them the victory because Benjamin had allied themselves with wickedness, with evil doing, with that which is against the Lord. And of course, the rest of chapter 20, we see that. Benjamin's caught in the trap, verses 36 through 48, that was set by the much larger army of Israel, a trap very reminiscent of some of Joshua's campaigns, and much of the tribe is obliterated as the consequence for their sin. Well, some principles and application we can take away from this just really saddening account here in the book of Judges. First, one thing that we need to remember is that civil authorities are established by God for our good. Without civil authorities, wickedness goes unchecked, just as it did during the latter time of the Judges and even in the earlier time here, as we see in Judges 19 and 20. In chapter 17, verse 6, we're told, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Romans 13, 3 and 4 tells us that rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority, Paul asked? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, once again, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. The Lord establishes government in order to keep law and order and to hold evil at bay to a certain degree. It is a minister by the Lord to do good. 1 Peter 2, 13 and 14, we see, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king or as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him, by that king, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. But without a king, without a governing authority in the land, we see horrible wickedness going unchecked. We could see the same thing in any age of mankind when there's been times for civil authorities not being in power or being totally corrupt and not doing what they're supposed to be doing. A second principle, we see how devastating the effects of sin, causing even brothers to fight against brothers, as the civil war between those tribes and Benjamin proved. Division between family members, listen, is the result when some stand for the Lord and others stand for themselves and the world. This is what Jesus promised in Luke 12, 49 through 53. Jesus said this, very strong language, I have come to cast fire upon the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and how distressed I am until it is accomplished. Do you suppose that I came to grant peace on earth? I tell you no, but rather division. For from now on, 5 members in one household will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. And as we apply these things to us, one, we need to uphold civil government. It doesn't mean that we bow down to every wish of the government. Of course, if they tell us to do evil, then we have to refuse that because we serve the Lord. But at the same time, to be anarchists is not what the Lord calls us to do. He has given government in order to create law and order to help hold back evil. We need to support that. And second, just the question, whose side are you going to prove to be on? Will you be on the side of New Sodom or the side of Yahweh? Will you be on the side of your flesh and the world and of Satan? Or will you be on the Lord's side? Have you turned from your sin and trusted in him? Are you proving it with your life? Well, this has been Judges 19 and 20, and I hope you have a great day.